Hello, everyone, and welcome to day 8 of Through the Bible. Today we're going to be taking a look at Genesis 28 through 32. Jacob finally finds his way to Haran, and when he gets there, he runs into some shepherds and eventually a shepherdess that's going to be his future wife by the name of Rachel. Now, we see that he meets his uncle. His uncle seems glad to see him, although his uncle could be somewhat, shall we say, different. He meets him, and he stays there for a while, for about a month, and then his uncle says, "Well, you should get some wages if you're going to work for me." So we see that both Rachel and Jacob were very industrious. They were very hard workers. They believed in getting things done. And so he comes up with a deal. He says, "I will work 7 years for you for your youngest daughter, Rachel." So he does. And it says that it only seemed like days because he loved her so much. And he wakes up after the wedding and finds out that he's with Lee, her older sister, who he was not really attracted to, instead of Rachel. And we see this Laban deception going on. So now the deceiver has been deceived, just like we were talking about was coming in his life. Sometimes we need that mirror to be able to see that our deception harms other people when that happens to us and we ourselves are harmed. So there are prescriptions in the Bible, but they come later. For example, in Leviticus 18:18, it says, "Don't marry two sisters." So obviously, this was a good example of why that should be. And then in 1 Corinthians 7:2, we obviously see that it's one man and one woman, and that's what God truly intends. We see that in the garden, we see it later, but somehow things got kind of messed up through the interim years, and there began to become polygamy, which the Bible does not support. Uh, it does see it as something that happened, but there's never any time in there where you actually see the Bible saying that that's a good thing. So you've got to keep that in mind. There are things in the Bible that are not necessarily good that the Bible recognizes but doesn't commend. And so that's important because some people will say, well, the Bible commends slavery. No, it recognizes that slavery exists. There's a big difference between those two things. In Genesis chapter 30, we see that Rachel is envious of her sister because she's now having children. That's a competition to give sons, and Rachel's not having any. Lee begins having sons, and envy is when you grieve at the good of another. It's not a good thing. When we grieve, when we feel bad because somebody else is blessed, and we need to pray and work through that in our lives. Lee is finding her self-worth in what she can give her husband, and because she felt so unloved by him. And this is not a good thing. This is probably the most dysfunctional family we've seen so far in the Bible. They probably would have ended up on one of today's crazy talk shows. But we see a lot of things not to do by all of this. So he works hard for Laban, Jacob does, and 7 years for Rachel, which ends up being Lee, and then another 7 years to actually get the wife that he desired in the first place. And all of this time he's working, and finally he gets ready. He says, "I'm going to go home." And Laban says, "Well, wait a minute, why don't you stay here and I'll pay you," and so forth. "Well, what do you want?" And I don't think Jacob necessarily trusted Laban, and that was probably a good thing. But he said, "Hey, look, I'll take these speckled and spotted, and you take everything else, and you'll be able to tell just by looking at them," was kind of the deal. Well, what's Laban do? He agrees to it, but then he turns around and takes everything. He makes it really difficult for Jacob to be able to actually get any of those lambs by taking those all away, giving them to his sons to watch, taking them on a 3-day journey away from him. He's just doing everything he can to make sure that Jacob is not blessed. He's actually working against the blessing of Jacob. However, through some strange circumstances, some things that seem very odd to us today, God works in it. Am I saying that the sticks and things that he put in the water and all of that? No, not at all. It was his mind. It was his concept of it. Maybe it was his faith trying to act out, but it was God that was actually blessing him. And so he was able to acquire things. And we see that it ends up that Laban ends up with the weak sheep, and Jacob ends up with the strong sheep. And Laban's sons apparently recognize this, and they start fussing and fuming over the fact that everything belonged to Dad, and he wouldn't be this wealthy if it wasn't for our family, and so forth and so on. And that's kind of interesting, and we see that in our lives today, where we don't want to take ownership for what's wrong in our life. We just want to look at it. It's another form of envy. We want to look at what's happening to other people and how they're being blessed, and instead of talking to God and saying, God, what do we need to do to be blessed? We start looking at other people and saying, well, they wouldn't be blessed if I wasn't working for them. We see employees do that all the time. Well, they wouldn't be blessed if this, they wouldn't be blessed if that, and that all belongs to me anyway. And that's not taking ownership for our lives. If we're not getting where we need to be, then we need to be talking to God, not to each other, and not to the people that are being blessed, unless we're there to ask their advice and their prayers. So we see that during that time that Laban changes his wages 10 times, God speaks to him. He says, I am the God of Bethel. I love this, because what's God do? He points back to a time when he had an encounter with Jacob, or Jacob had an encounter with him, and reminds him of who he is. And God's going to do that to us sometimes. I know in my own life, sometimes I'm questioning things or wondering about things, and God points back to something he did that was an obvious miracle, that was an obvious, incredible incident that he took care of. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's why I believe. That's why I'm moving forward. Matter of fact, in the Bible, in Revelation, the very last book, it says they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. It's our testimony that gets us through. So pile them up, write them down, and remember them, and God will bring them back to your remembrance as well. So he ends up sneaking away from his father-in-law in the middle of the night. 3 days later, his father-in-law finds out about it. He runs after them. He's ready to do them harm, but God warns him in a dream the night before. He says, don't say anything to him, good or bad. He kind of does anyway, but not in a horrible way. He doesn't actually attack him or anything. And he comes in and he says, why did you do this? Why did you deceive me? I would have sent you off with a party. Well, I don't think any of us actually believe that, based on the relationship that Laban had with Jacob earlier, and all the cheating and all the things he did, changing his wages 10 times, trying to make it difficult for him to succeed. The wives even said that all the money that Jacob had given them, all the prosperity God had given him, Laban had just spent it. And so he wasn't very good, apparently, at accumulating wealth. He was really good at spending it. So when Jacob kind of responded to him in kind of a harsh way and said, look, you've done this to me and that to me, and if it hadn't been for God, I wouldn't have anything. You would have sent me away with nothing after over 20 years of labor for you. And Laban just doubles down. He just gets his back all up, and he had just said, I by divination I learned that I've been blessed because of you. So he even recognized that he was blessed because of Jacob, but he still wasn't willing to humble himself. And instead he said, everything belongs to me. All of it's mine. But what can I do about it? In other words, God just spoke to me and warned me, hey, if you do anything, then I'm coming after you. And so Laban's kind of feeling lost, but at the same time, he's unwilling to put down his pride. He's unwilling to admit where he's been wrong. So they end up making a memorial of peace, and they go their separate ways. Sometimes that's all we can do, is come to a point of peace and then walk away. It would be nice if we could always have a wonderful reconciliation and we could work out all of our issues and all of our problems. But sometimes with some folks, it's just not possible. So we find a place of peace and we move on. Whenever possible, I think we should come together. And if we can't, it's because one of those parties is unwilling to do that. But if both parties really have the heart of God, I believe that it will always be a case where we can always work it out. And maybe we still end up doing things differently or going in different paths, but there won't be that strain on the relationship that's just there, like we see with Laban and with Jacob. So they made a memorial there. They went their separate ways. And in Genesis 32, we see that Jacob wrestles with the Lord. And he wrestles with a man, is what the Bible says. But we know that by all kinds of ways that it's the Lord he's dealing with. But at the same time, it's not really, how many of you know the Lord could have stop Jacob in a minute. He wasn't trying to stop Jacob. What he was trying to do was make Jacob wrestle with himself. And boy, I could just preach that one right here. How many times does God put us in a situation where we're wrestling with ourself? We're wrestling with the things that are in our life. We're wrestling with the doubt that we have. We're wrestling with our lack of faith. We're wrestling with those sin struggles that we have in our life, those attitudes, those belief systems, those strongholds, whatever it might be. And we have to struggle with ourselves. And God will bring us to a Penuel, where we have to struggle with Him and with ourselves in order to move forward into our destiny and into our purpose. And that's exactly what happens here. He names the place Penuel, the face of God. He faced God face to face. And when he did, he saw a reflection of himself and what he needed to be, and also recognized fully what he wasn't. And so those things are very important. And after this point, we know that he walked differently. So not only did he now have the memorial that he set up with Laban for the future, where he could look back and say that's a place where peace came, but he could have an even better memorial actually in his body. Every time he had trouble walking, every time he limped, every time he tried to go somewhere and he had that little catch, he remembered that time when he wrestled with God. So he had a constant reminder. There was a time when you wrestled with God. All of us should always remember those wrestlings with God and what God was taking us to and where He's taking us to today, because it's only going to be in those wrestlings and us overcoming not God, but overcoming ourselves with God, that we're going to be able to go where God wants us to go. So, there's another thing that happened too. Not only was it a testimony for him, but it was also a testimony for all the generations to come, because they set up a dietary rule that said they couldn't eat the socket of the hip because of what happened at Penuel. So just kind of a cool cultural thing that happened that day as well. So there you go, chapters 29 through 32 of Genesis. And I believe you got a day off tomorrow. If you're getting behind, this is a great time to catch up. And then we'll be right back to it with, let's see, chapters 33, 34, 35, and 36. God bless you. Have a wonderful, wonderful day, and we look forward to seeing you next time.